Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Alistair Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Al and Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep.
Well, Alistair, good to see you again. You're looking really sharp there. I think that foundation is the right colour for you. What are we going to be talking about today?
Thanks, Juddy. What we're talking about today is how farmers form opinions on a favourite cultivar and how often they're created by relatively specific observations. So today's podcast is looking at the trials and tribulations of picking a favourite.
You know what? This has the potential to go a lot of different places and could end up like a couple of old blokes in one of those puppet shows that I remember watching. So,
it's too true, Juddy. Too true.
So in terms of starting that, we probably need to talk a little bit about our experience in terms of trialing, and let's say different forage species within an animal system. So I guess what's your experience?
Oh, look, I think probably you're right. We should probably just sort of give some context to why we could talk about this topic, is that we've both been really heavily involved in evaluating and demonstrating different species of pastoral genetics across the Southern Hemisphere, and in your case into the Northern Hemisphere as well, Glenn. But my background started sort of creating extension networks from the late 90s in the east coast of Australia and from all around New Zealand, with, relatively speaking, a very small resource base back then. And so we had to form relationships, and we had to look at different operators that were working throughout the Southern Hemisphere, really, to demonstrate differences between genetics and prove value and all the way through. And what I would say is that it really does give you a strong awareness of how people form opinions, react to things. I would actually say react to things is quite a big deal. One-off situations can form an opinion that actually take many, many good examples before they actually forget the one-off situation. And that's been a symptom all the way through our careers of, responding to problems, but problems can very much be temporary, only for things to be really, really positive at a later date. So, establishing trialling networks, replicated trials, demonstrations, observation paddocks, first paddocks, all these things have been pretty much my history. And now today I'm really privileged to be in amongst a wonderful team of R&D people, both within the greater business investment in R&D, but also inside Agricom's R&D footprint, which is really extensive. And we've got some wonderful young staff who are delivering really high quality research throughout the country to literally help everyone pick favourites.
So specifically, I guess what you're talking about here is they go from scientific plot trials, which have got a set of protocols around those. So that's one source of evaluation. You've mentioned you've got kind of split paddocks where you've got two different cultivars, if you like.
There's lots of different styles of demonstration and observation, Juddy. And I mean, you've been a massive part of this yourself with different species, looking at kale and particularly with Marshdale, looking at different things within Marshdale's environment as well, which is, again, not replicated, but it's a whole farmlet type research.
Yeah, and I think the other complicating factor here, Alistair, is sometimes we use those trials to look at some key agronomic characteristics of our different forages. And I remember one that really stood out as, and we've covered this in a previous podcast about the different types of ryegrass moving from an annual through to a perennial and the hybrids in between, and maybe some companion species, and having them all in the same place at the same time and watching what happens over time. So really some of the things that we see are very short-lived in terms of maybe a seeding event or a period of rapid growth. So actually having, a very diverse number of forages there, it can be quite useful. I guess the next bit is,
but also very complicated.
Very complicated. Yep. There's certainly lots of differences there. And then with that, complicated background, you then put an animal system over the top of it. And I actually remember some of the plot trials that we had in, or small strips and paddocks, trying to interpret things like grazing preference, where we've got this cafeteria diet, and we release some animals in there and trying to work out what's driving preference.
I remember those adjacent monocultures we did probably in the early to mid 2000s, where you had your plantain and your ryegrass side by side, and we were learning about them pretty much at the same time, what might have been happening within a normal pasture, but because we separated them, we could actually see what was happening with animal choice.
Yeah, and so that whole idea that preference in terms of, which is a really interesting thing, because it's one thing that farmers will interpret as if animals eat one thing over the other, they clearly like that. And so it's
but the other interpretation of that is, but the thing that I invested in and I liked, which is using a plantain as an example, the fact it's not there in 2 years' time, you ignore the fact that it's been eaten particularly low multiple times without you seeing it in the pasture.
Yes.
And it's not until you separate them that you could actually see the way the animals were behaving on them.
And the other thing that really struck me, and this was some work that we did when we were looking at a number of different ryegrasses, particularly around flowering date, even, and where the time of the year that we released these animals into that, if we were going early, it looked like the grasses that were closest to their flowering date were the more preferred, and then later in the season, those ones had gone seedy, they were the less preferred, and the later flowering ryegrasses, because it was late, became more preferred.
Yeah.
So
that whole context of every dog has its day. It's just how you judge it on its day.
Yes, and that's where you can see if you've got farmers that might have a gate open between two paddocks and observe that animals are always in one, or what they perceive as always in one, and then pick that as their favourite.
I think that's a really good segue into the first sort of phase of this discussion, really, where that's our backgrounds. We've had some really wide experience in both relationships with contractors around Australasia, carrying out trials and all the pitfalls and dynamics associated with different people's trialing techniques and how they might manage them in different landscapes, but also these sort of management-orientated trials where we get to observe more things as we go. So this is how both Juddy and myself have sort of cut our teeth through our career, and now we've got a whole wonderful resource base of trials and demonstrations littered throughout Australasia, and get to see some really amazing stuff over the time. But it really does create a lead back into, as a farmer, as a producer, you have absolutely it should be seen as part of your business to be aware of what you're sowing. It should be part of your business success to get the best out of what you are growing and hopefully multiplying what you believe are your favorites. And so one of the pathways in this podcast is to sort of just discuss some of the things that you need to be wary of when you're starting to create your favorites, because you need a little bit of knowledge about what you're comparing, what you're looking at, and how you do it. And your open gates scenario was a really classical one as part of my heritage, is that I was bringing in new grass to the New Zealand sheep industry in the late 90s, early 2000s. And at that very same time, genetics was starting to be developed that were more late flowering, but still quite effective in springtime. But they were winter active, and they were able to be used on New Zealand farms very successfully. And so the grass that I was bringing to market was an early spring grass that was quite aggressive in spring, fitted very, very well in a set stock sheep system. Really good example. But at the same time, another grass was becoming quite popular, which was a whole 20 days later to go to seed. Now, watching the way those two grasses were used in demonstration by individual farmers, and also the retail networks comparing grasses within people's farms, it was really interesting to see what happened when often in set stock sheep systems, when pasture covers get too low, you tend to find the gates start to get open and they go through a phase of set stocking, which is you're opening
multiple paddocks.
You're opening them up to choice of multiple paddocks. And what was happening is that one of the greatest principles of preference for sheep was being expressed, and that is a sheep will always take a green leaf over a stem. And with a difference of flowering date of 20 days, what you saw is these ewes and lambs were actively seeking out the paddock that had no seed head being developed, no pseudostem pushing up, even if initially it was creating extra growth. So initially the sheep would have been on it because it was creating extra growth. And so the extra growth was coming from the emergence of reproductive development. But then at a critical point when they were given choice, as that stem started to lignify, they could walk through a gate onto a paddock that was 20 days later flowering and had just leaf, no seed head in sight. So they would target the leaf, take the stocking pressure off the paddock that was about to go to seed. That would completely go to seed, and this other paddock was completely leafy. And it's so easy to judge that as a varietal thing. One is good and one is bad, whereas really you're comparing two things that were quite a long way apart and allowing animals to take a very predictable choice of taking leaf over stem at a critical point of time.
Yeah, so I guess that's where it comes in. You go, the observation's correct. The interpretation of that is the bit that's because by selecting the later flowering one, right? If you were grazing that at the same relative date relative to flowering, you would have got exactly the same answer. It was just that it was the same date and therefore relative difference
when you're giving them an option. And more importantly, if you had shut the gate and kept them on the earlier one, you'd have found you might have carried 2 or 3 more sheep, because that is extra spring growth under that set stock phase, and that you may have kept on top and converted most of that emerging seed head into forage. And yes, when they started to rotate, it still might have shot to seed a little bit faster, but it may have held more animals than that leafy later type, because that later type wasn't growing anything extra. It was just growing vegetatively.
In my experience, Alistair, and I think this story bears out, in my experience, handing the choice of what animals eat over to the animals seldom comes out to be very useful and productive. And so I think the ability to shut those gates, we have them there for a purpose, keep animals in areas that we want them to graze, I think is the critical bit here. If we let the whole adage that animals know what's good for them really becomes quite undone when we consider something like nitrate poisoning, for example, because we shouldn't have it if they knew what was good for them. So I think
or noxious weeds that they actively go and seek, or something like a leaf turnip, which is quite bitter, but can grow a lamb at 300 grams a day, and that lamb would actively seek out ryegrass, which would be full of L3 larvae and could give it parasitic worms, and also grow it at only 80 grams a day.
Yeah, so
and yet it would desperately try not to eat the leaf turnip because of how bitter it may have become if you left it too long. But if you made it eat it, it would be incredibly healthy. The animal would be in amazing health and growing extremely fast, but it would have chosen to eat the wormy grass around the outside of the paddock that would make it grow 80 grams a day and fill it full of parasitic.
And the frustrating thing, Alistair, is that it's very repeatable.
Yes,
you're absolutely right.
Every single year that happens.
So I think in that case,
how like humans are they? Like an interesting thing is we give animals these anthropomorphic beliefs, and as a human population, we can't do it right.
No. Giving animals choice, and really the other thing that's really interesting about preference when you come back to that, where we've got that open gate, is this preference is all about what the choices are, and it's one of the examples that I love to recall because it really did demonstrate to me that whole thought around preference is actually the product of what the other choices are. And so I remember in a perennial ryegrass plot trial we were grazing, we had one hybrid in there. And in that perennial ryegrass, when we plot trial, when we grazed that hybrid was grazed to a very low level. It was a highly preferred plot within that trial. The exact same grass was in a plot amongst a whole lot of Italian ryegrasses and was the least well grazed. There was a huge residual on that. So the idea here is that it was the same grass, it was just the context with which it was in. So for me, if I want to describe that as an analogy, you go, it's a bit like my kids, right? If you actually give them some potatoes, right, and the choice is broccoli, they'll eat the potatoes every time. But if you give them some potatoes and the other choice is dessert, well, the potatoes aren't going to get a look in. So the idea that this preference does depend on what the other choices are.
Absolutely.
And so
and the most important point here, it's not right or wrong. They have their own characteristics. They fit in your systems in their own way. It is really the interpretation of these things. And I think that stems back to what we're discussing is that, the trials and tribulations of actually picking a favorite is actually to know a bit of detail. And the heart and soul of this podcast is to recognize that if you find something that is really good, it is the fact that it can be multiplied multiple times and make a difference to your business. So actually taking the time to understand how you're observing things, or more importantly, even acknowledging what you're seeing. So if something's really getting strong after a drought, acknowledge that and recognize it, and then ask yourself, well, should I be putting more in? So this is where we step out of all the different ways farmers can demonstrate things. Our weaknesses in the past have always been we're brought into farms where our products haven't performed against something else that they liked, which so they put that in there and they put something in over there. But the issue at the very heart and soul of it, they weren't the same paddock. And then we come back into the discussion of what happens if you put them in the same paddock, and it hits the same topic we just discussed. One, management, and then the management's the defining feature of what happens afterwards. One, grazing residual a little bit lower, and for a long period of time, the one side of the paddock is going to be influenced by that one event. It's not normal, because if it was in another paddock by itself, you'd be managing it as its own. So how does a farmer really get that sort of confidence?
Yeah, and the really good example there is where we have tetraploids, for example.
Good example.
In with diploids, and it could be a split paddock, for example, or in a plot trial or something where you're grazing, because you will overgraze that tetraploid far before you even get to a decent residual in your diploid. And that's just real. The only way you can change that is with a mower.
And the key to that moment is that, and I've seen this time and time again, is that, once you overgraze a product once, does it ever reach its genetic potential? And so when it's actually in a plot trial that's been overgrazed and not leveled to a common height, the variety that's been hit the hardest may never reflect its genetic potential within that trialing environment. So there are all the subtleties that can happen on farm, and it is really an interesting process. So what we're saying is that you should always try and find your favorite, because it's the favorite that may make the difference to your business's economics, because of the traits that you start to recognize and value, especially if you acknowledge what's working, acknowledge those critical points where you're spending lots of money on farm, but your choice of new grass or 3 or 4 year old grass is making a difference at a critical moment. That's really important to acknowledge, because multiplying that is what makes a difference to farm. But how do you get to those decisions on how do you go about it? How do you trust something? And how do you make that decision is the key to this discussion.
I think coming back, you did mention or make a point, and I just want to kind of labor that, and that's around actually knowing what is in your paddock. Because a lot of times when you see farm maps, and you might have the long paddock, or you might have the round paddock or whatever, but actually when you go and look to see what actually was sown in there, what were your species, what was the grass, often that detail is not added to that. And so I always
flowering date.
Flowering date's a great one.
Yeah, it's a really good one. It's like a one-off thing. You can find it from marketing material, and it's the one thing that you can literally work out exactly when you're going to have management issues in a singular paddock. And if it's a late, you can work it out that it will be the end of spring and early summer. If it's a mid, it's the middle of summer. but it's highly predictable. And when you know that's going to have an impact on the future pasture quality of any single paddock you're working with, wouldn't you want to know about it? Wouldn't you want to know, oh, this one's going to go off next? I can literally, as of today, predict when you're going to lose pasture quality on virtually every named paddock you've got on a farm if I know the variety as of today. And that's a hellishing useful thing for ordering your rotations, working out where your silage is going to be.
Huge tool.
And yet not a soul does it.
Yeah. I'd like to see, it'd be really interesting to have a look at a feed wedge, for example, and not only have the paddock name, but at least a description of what's actually in that paddock, or certainly what was sown there, because that could be quite useful in terms of, again, planning, so strategy around what you're going to sow, but also the tactics in terms of each spring, being able to predict when we're going to get seed head.
What a great example you brought up there. Something we've both worked very closely with our team for a number of years with is tall fescue. By understanding, and we moved from once upon a time just calling them generically early flowering tall fescue and late. Now we've put dates around it. And now that we understand the dates, our tall fescue, as of today, goes to head in the end of the first month of spring, which is nearly a month and a half to nearly 2 months earlier than the majority of perennial ryegrass options in New Zealand today, which means that if you don't know that, it's a hell of a shock and it's a hell of an issue for catching up with something that you didn't realize it was going to be that early in your season.
And I think where in the past we've had some issues with people not being able to control tall fescue, or it's getting very seedy and we can't get on top of it. And a lot of the solution to that has been you need a high stocking rate. And I think that.
But no one's ready to do it that early.
That seeding date information says actually it's not having a huge stocking rate later in the season. It's actually starting early.
Yeah, correct.
Because it's coming that early.
Starting at low covers and having faith that it's going to
come. And as you've pointed out to me, Alistair, you're looking at the ground temperatures and you're looking at this saying, oh, it's cold. Maybe those fescues aren't on their way. You've got to have some faith there, because I think you've mentioned that this is driven largely by daylight. And therefore, it's the same every season.
It's coming ready or not, regardless of the weather conditions.
Yeah,
so if you turn your back on it, you call it a management issue. But if you have faith and realize it's coming, you're ready for it.
And again, the worst cases I've seen of that has been that fescue paddock, one of them. So you're not really ready for it, and it's in a part of the farm you never go to. And all of a sudden you turn up there, 3 weeks later than you should have been, and you've got
half a hay crop.
You've got half a hay crop, and you're not going to get that back very easily. So I think it's good to understand those differences.
Yeah, and that's the key to the farmer observations for creating favourites, is that as long as you understand you can't compare between paddocks, because the paddocks history is not the same. You can't compare between paddocks because one grazing management within that paddock that either disadvantages or advantages a grass can last for the rest of the season. You can't compare between paddocks because carrying grass in the establishment phase versus grazing another one early could have a huge difference on legume content. And that may carry on for between 18 months and nearly 2 years. And so the impact of just putting two grasses in two different paddocks and thinking that's enough to create an observation isn't really that right. Then, like we've already discussed, the observations about what animals do with your pasture, I feel on average, we can, it is quite difficult to interpret those quite well, because just as I've said, if you graze well once, you can quite find that you graze well consistently. But what you probably haven't picked up is you haven't grown as much, because you've actually unfortunately overgrazed it. But in overgrazing, you've set the quality at a high level, and so you're impacting its performance the whole way through. So there's quite a few things that you can observe, and this is really important and it's really functional, is when you damage pastures, how they bounce back. When pastures go brown and dry, how they recover. I feel the one thing I would be careful about is not over judging and forming favourites off young pasture. Young pasture tends to go pretty darn well, and you spend quite a bit of time trying to get the best from your young pasture, where you can make some good money out of young pasture as a finishing source or a high performance group of paddocks. You pay quite a lot of attention to. So the point being, I think, observations around 2 or 3 year old paddocks, I actually rate as more powerful than new paddocks. So that's something to be aware of. I feel all those things are really valid observations, damage, how I recover from damage, how I recover from stress, how I look in my second and third and fourth year, maybe second and third, because you're still going to make a decision of what you're going to do next. Can't wait forever. But the point being is don't make decisions on first year crops because they all look good.
Yeah, I remember seeing 2 photos, and I know you took them, and they were in the same spot because I could see the same tree in the background.
There might have been a small story associated with that one, which we won't go into.
But what struck me was, and the point about coming back to going, how do they look when they're in the recovery mode? And I remember the first photo shows a paddock that's been grazed off in some pretty tricky winter conditions. And to be fair, there was a lot of mud there. And there wasn't a lot of huge damage, but there wasn't a lot of grass left, and it looked pretty muddy. And it was a grass that's very active in that winter phase. And within a month, same photo, it was completely back. Yeah, the lines were there. It was quite remarkable, and I guess that did demonstrate that's being resilient to some of those things. We can't always control how we graze, but that grass was particularly good in terms of resilience to one grazing event. And I thought that was a really good example.
Absolutely. And so, moving on to how you'd continue to get enough information to even start to pick a favourite.
Yes, because this is really interesting.
Package this out.
Yeah, this is a really interesting discussion, because what we're saying is there's a whole lot of problems with just looking at a pasture in a single farm system, right?
In isolation.
In isolation.
Yeah.
So how what can you do to get a read on what you think might work in a farm system?
Well, first things first, we've discussed 2 or 3 things that we need to repeat, because I think we should repeat it time and time again, because I think it's really powerful, is that if you find a favourite that works in your farm, you need to acknowledge it, because if you can multiply it beyond 30 to 40% of your farming enterprise, the things that you have identified that you like are financially important. It's almost mind-blowing to think that some people don't look at that detail, at the heart and soul, the engine of their property, which is their pastoral system or their forage system. So if you find a favourite, it's actually multiplying it to a big enough scale that you can actually have so much confidence in your feed supply, your time of year, that you can actually change your business, because you often can't change your economic profile if you don't change something. And you can only change something in your farming business if you have absolute confidence it's reliable, it's happening time and time again, and it's got a scalable size for a critical time frame to make a difference. So not reporting on what you're sowing, not being aware of the impact of flowering date or choice or whatever, and then not observing these moments more so than the direct comparisons, but the moments that you value, I feel that's a heart and soul where, that's our call out, is that we think you should think about that as a strategic part of your farm improvement and your own personal improvement of what you're thinking about sowing and producing on your properties.
And I think the other bit here is that needs to be taken in context of the animal system. And so it might be that that it's money-making time at lactation in a sheep system, for example, and therefore the plant, I won't say grass, but the plant that provides the biggest benefit to animals at that time could actually all drop to the bottom line. Okay. And so actually understanding how your plant responds to the animal system you're driving is equally as important as understanding what that plant wants to do in the environment. And so I think those 2 things coupled together, it makes it really powerful. And that also means that just because your neighbour sows something, gets good value out of that, if he doesn't have exactly the identical system to you, then you may make a different decision because you may lamb later, or you may have some deer on the property and no cattle.
You may see a golf ball for 2 more weeks.
Yeah, exactly.
Than the neighbour does.
Yes, and so actually useful, but your farm then becomes quite unique in terms of that.
Because what you're now describing is the management interaction
and I guess,
of your stock policies and your farm management.
And your call to action really is around observing those things.
Yeah, but acknowledging what you're using.
Yep.
Taking a little bit of personal responsibility for knowing what you're using and what it actually is, a bit of detail. Let's just say the devil's in the detail, and then it's the multiplier of that detail. So stepping into the next scenario here is it's like what are demonstrations that are highly functional and work? And at the end of the day, some of the things we've described are massive limitations to just demonstrations. In my humble opinion, demonstrations are best when they're in cropping systems, when you've got a single harvest, one-off crop type scenario. And using demonstrations of one thing versus another in a cropping type system, I feel it's actually black and white. And that's why cropping systems have it really easy, be it, summer crops, winter crops, maize, anything that has a one-off harvest, you can compare them directly in a demonstration, be it replicated or not. I feel the problem we've already alluded to as far as demonstrations with the paddocks is that once the animal asserts 1 ounce of preference, everything you see from then therefore after has been influenced by that, and the comparison has been influenced by that moment. It doesn't mean that preference stays in that order for the rest of the time, but now there's been a management interaction that's overlaying, and therefore the animal's responding to it's had a preference one-off, but from there forth, it's sort of the management interaction that is meaning they'll come back to that spot again and again, and come back to that spot then again, regardless of what if they were in 2 separate paddocks would have happened at any one point of time. So I think demonstration of multi-graze things where you split paddocks, what are good examples of demonstrating? For me, it's the same variety with different endophytes would be a really good example. They're all the same. The endophytes are all the same, and you're just wanting to understand the relevance and value of the grass is all the same, the genetics, it's a diploid ryegrass. It's got an X heading date. You're putting it in the paddock, you're splitting it, and you're putting 2 or 3 different endophyte options within the same paddock. Now, all the morphology is happening. The preference is pretty heavily set by the nutritional profile of the grass. The heading date's the same. However, now we've got a different endophyte in the landscape, and if there is a difference that emerges, you're going to see it in 2 or 3 ways. One, is there insects present, and are they destroying parts of the paddock and not other parts? And that's part of your reason for doing this would be, is that endophyte providing value in my environment? That's a good demonstration. But more specifically, if you start to see animal grazing behavior between different endophytes, you now understand that there might be a palatability issue associated with your endophyte choice. So I feel using endophyte within the same grass or trying to understand the endophyte is a good place to demonstrate. I think that's a really good one. But 2 different grasses, there's too much difference in morphology, flowering dates, ploides, your choices of options. Once there is one management interaction within that paddock,
it's difficult.
Yeah.
So
does that sort of make sense?
Yeah. So I guess if you move on to some of the more controlled trialing that certainly you've been involved with.
Well, let's just say from a farmer perspective, artificial because it's managed, it's controlled. And so, this is the point where we're moving through a pathway where all the things we've just described are things that start to become out of control, and your interpretation can get really heavily influenced by a lot of circumstances. When you're talking about coming in a replicated environment, or a trial environment, you're talking about the levels of control you're prepared to exert.
So when you talk about these very controlled trials, give me an example of how would they be set up?
Well, there's a couple of different things, but let's talk about one that might be on a farm. So, you might have a business like ourselves with a group of agronomists that are highly effective nationally that will run replicated plot trials in the regions. And so, we will target trying to find an environment that we want to 2 or 3 different traits. It might be known to have a certain insect pressure if we're trying to look at endophyte interactions, might have a certain soil fertility regime or whatever. But we will be looking for as uniform parts of paddocks as we possibly can get. And we'll do this because what we are going to do is put a relatively small plot in to represent a variety. We're going to replicate it 4 times. And I like to portray that a replicate is literally just a single paddock.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if it's 1.5 meters by 5 meters, which is a traditional plot size as an example. But the best way to interpret it is it's one paddock, because then you're going to go and put another paddock in, 10 meters away, and then another paddock, another 5 meters off to the left and 3 meters off to the right. We're going to have another paddock, and that's called replication. You can't do that easily at macro levels on farms. So we'll have 4 replicates, and we'll have any number of entries, and we'll be able to compare many, many different things.
So you'd sow those with like a tractor and a plot drill.
Yeah. And you'd use any number of statistical layouts and designs, because always we're slowly trying to take control of all the influences so we can actually see what's different between these things.
Did you hear?
And so more control, the better.
Did you hear that the plot drill, right, broke up its relationship with the tractor? Did you hear about that?
No, I didn't, Juddy.
It was a case of a Dear John Deere.
Oh.
Just thought I'd throw that one in there. So at the plot level, so let's get back to this. So at the plot level, we've got a lot of control.
Yeah,
it's just that it's probably more about the potential of some of those things going in, not what you'd find out on farm.
That's correct. Well, what we're trying to do is take away those individual management events that may have a lifelong effect of a single variety, and what you're trying to do is give every single bit of genetics, doesn't matter what type of trialing you do, a fair chance to express itself without a management interaction on one that will disadvantage it for the rest of the life of the trial. And that's what you do with the so-called grazing preference. And that's why even taking animals off plot trials can sometimes be almost essential, because when you're putting species with high levels of variability and exactly how palatable they are, it doesn't mean they're better. It's just that you've got tetraploids, diploids, you've got different palatability regimes. But, you've got wonderful diploids that may not just be as palatable as a tetraploid. You've got big, tall tetraploids that may take a hammering and never grow again afterwards. Yeah. So you can't really afford, and none of them are bad. They're all actually really functional and good. It's just you got to give them a level playing field that doesn't have long-term influences on it.
And I think the other thing that's really relatively obvious to me, but maybe not to others, is one of the big issues about grazing those plot trials is the urine patch. Some of those plots will be getting a dump of nitrogen that others won't.
Yeah, and it's not even necessarily the most preferred. It's just circumstantial. All of that's luck.
Yes.
When it's on that smaller area, you might find that due to its the plot trial location within its fenced area, means they're mobbed up in a corner and urinated heavily on the top right-hand corner. Yep. And so if you've got a plot there, you have this really artificial nutrient transfer.
Yeah. So
that's not reflective of normal
plots
situation.
In stock camps get extra nutrient, but probably get more traffic. And if you like that, then you're probably going to be it's going to be favourable.
Well, the point is it's a thing that our statistical design can moderate through replication, but you got to ask the question: can a full rep trial actually take away that variation? You might need to have 5 or 6 replicates to tolerate that.
So coming back to we've talked a lot about the observations we're seeing on farm. We're talking now about replicated plot trials and trying to have a bit more control over that. In terms of summary, what in a farmer trying to make a decision or trying to pick a favorite, as you say, and trying to get that onto farm to make a difference. Give me a feel for the balance between some of those observations.
Well, the thing about it is that, again, the pastoral world is really, I would say, genetic gain and everything's been highly sort of we're almost too close to it, is what I'm saying. As an industry, we're almost too close to the discussion. And what we fail to recognize is when maize and other species get held up in their genetic gain, they're a single harvest crop. We are the mean of means. So, for example, we're going to put a deployed perennial ryegrass trial out in New Zealand today, and there's a very good chance if you put it behind a fence to try and create an even and fair environment, we will harvest in the New Zealand conditions about 10 to 11 times a year. And often we'll keep a trial like that in the ground for 3 years. That is 33 individual measurements where one thing might be up one day and then down the next and up the next and down the next. And so what you're talking about is the mean of means. And when you're doing lamb live weight gains, you can see very, very clearly that once you've got about 19, 20 measurements on your scales, your figures aren't changing because of the next lamb that's turning up. You get this stabilization of your figures. And this is the one weakness with the trialing when you're doing these long thin things. Unless something dies or unless something has an outrageous advantage associated with, for example, an endophyte, we are doing means, and often differences become highly predictable but very small. And so you run around looking at trials with only a 3% advantage after 3 years. But the point is, it's all about the reliability of it. So I would keep coming back into what trials offer relative to farm observations and other things. It offers a predictability of, is this likely to happen? Am I likely to be able to respond? There's so many other things that will influence whether you can or not. But what we're doing is separating some of these things. So what are you looking for from plot trials that you should be interested in? For me personally, it's seasonality.
Yeah, seasonality is a big one.
Yeah. So you're just looking at when things grow, because that's when you start to think about what's important for your farm. So seasonality is one. Another thing might be disease, if there's information anyone's presenting on disease tolerances, because, you might be in an environment that is very prone to this sort of stuff. I'm wondering why my pastures are always orange or whatever. Well, disease is something that not everything's the same. We can't really pick up heading dates that much in trials. We often manage them to a point where you don't see seed head like in a more intensive and high performance rotation. But summer recovery and autumn growth, you can often get some really strong information that will give you an element of confidence of how things might recover in the autumn. So for me, it's relatively narrow. It's mostly about seasonality. It's mostly about consistency. It's quite nice to see things presented. This is how it did in year 1, where everything goes nuts. This is how it's done in year 2, where, it's starting to become a bit of a normalized landscape. And by year 3, quite often it's a depleted landscape. It's never performing to its same level, may have been influenced by summers, winters, and insects. And so seeing how things finish in year 3 is quite important. And I go into even a little bit of extra detail. It's how does it finish at the end of the 3rd year is quite a good indicator as to how it's come out of the last summer and moving into its 4th year. So all those things are what you can get out of plot trials. And all they do is provide you a starting point to consider, to check it out for yourself and provide confidence. And it's almost like the whole confidence range of plot trials. It's nothing to do with which is truly the best. Statistically, the top 10 are probably very, very good. But once you've looked at the way it's producing, when it's producing, end-of-fight combination, how it's finishing, those sort of things provide you an element of confidence that if I give this a go, there's a chance that I'm going to see a similar result. And then it's up to you with your management to work out, do you actually like it and will it become your new favorite?
Yeah. In an attempt to try and summarize all that, there's probably a couple of really clear messages here. I think the first one is around making those observations, but being careful about the interpretation of that out on farm.
Yeah,
but I think
always it's the interpretation that may just lead you off on a wild goose chase.
Yep. And so that interpretation, I think, is really critical. But that shouldn't be that we shouldn't look It's
No.
just that we need to be careful about that interpretation.
And you should always be interested in what you're seeing.
I think
You
that's
should be just asking why.
the next question or the next comment I'd make is we've made quite a bit about knowing what you've got there.
Yeah.
And trying to at least have an interpretation of some of the differences you're seeing. So first, observe those. Two, the information around knowing what's in your paddocks and there being able to try and work out whether that's an environmental thing or where you've got some of these genetics driving that. I really like your comments around, on top of that, then we've got the complication of the animal system and the demands of that. So we've got to think about when are the critical times in those animal systems where we need feed or we need to hold quality or we need other recovery, for example. So I think the animal system over the top is the complicating one. And I do really, I think that your comments are really very good around the use of those plot trials. When we get presented plot trials, remembering that these are the potential of these different varieties, and that the key things to take out of those are really around the seasonality and, as you say, the recovery and what they're doing at key times. So I think that's instead of just relying on paddock observations or plot trials, it's really the art of bringing all of that together and working out what some of these genetics can do in specific
100%.
farms and in specific farm systems.
And Glenn, I'll just finish and just put my last two bits into that summary and say, picking favorites makes your world interesting, because it actually means that you've been prepared to check out some detail about your property that is actually the heart and soul of your production system, and that you've taken enough notice to be interested. And it seems weird saying that, but you would be very surprised to understand how few people actually know what's on their farm. And so picking favorites and then making the traits that you acknowledge that they are performing on your farm mean something. Because I can honestly say you must have, for some traits, such as, for example, really powerful autumn growth. You found a favorite that does super well in the autumn. Having 2 paddocks out of 50 means nothing to your production system. So once you identify something that has actually got some up power and can make a difference to how you're feeling about your confidence of feed supply coming out of a drought and into an autumn or in late autumn going into winter, it doesn't mean a thing on your farm unless you can multiply it across a larger landscape. So getting 30 to 40% of your farm in a high horsepower autumn grass, for example, and you acknowledging that it's doing that is the sort of thing that makes you have confidence of doing things like maintaining your lactation for another 10 days, going all the way into the start of winter with your lactation, meaning that you can actually keep beef and sheep off winter crop for 10 days, and maybe meaning that you can put less winter crop in because you're doing that. Tapping ewes late in a cold environment, having good feed reliably, consistently every year because of a varietal choice, and you multiplied it to such a degree every ewe can get access it before tapping, makes a big difference to your farm. And so, when people say, but how do I make these grasses pay? You make them pay by multiplying things that you've acknowledged work in your farm to a level that you can actually change your farm. Because if you can't change anything on your farm, most of your productive parameters are set.
Yeah, good point.
So multiply something you appreciate to a scale that you can make a change to your farm. And if you can make a change to your farm, you should make a change to your bottom line.
Oh, well, that's a lot. Listen, I've got to go. I've got a flat tire and a flat battery on my electric motorbike. So it's going to be an interesting afternoon. So I better go. Catch you next time.
See you, Juddy.